Hello, welcome to another episode of Executive Suite. I'm your host, Thomas Braun, and today we have with us Tanvir Kathawala from Pioneer 1890, which is focused on the defense industry. And I'm going to let Tanvir introduce the company to us. It's a fascinating subject matter and possibly will end up being the most interesting podcast I've done this year. We'll see. Tanvir, can you please give us the elevator speech about Pioneer 1890?
Well, first off, thank you so much for having me, Thomas. Pioneer 1890 was really born out of my experience as a venture-backed entrepreneur, then a privately backed executive, where I saw so many great technologies and capabilities that look great as a prototype, will look great in a pilot stage, but never really made it to that production level or that infamous valley of death. And so what we do is we acquire founder-led businesses in the defense industrial base, and we put them together, and then we have a shared, capabilities of shared services like M&A and government relations that allow companies that are highly specialized to focus continually on their customer set, but get the benefits of being part of a larger platform. And it's been a great journey so far, and we're really grateful to be looking at some phenomenal companies, and I'm thrilled to share more on our conversation today.
Okay, so you help these uh, early stage companies find capital, and then you help them manage their way to scaling up. And you've you've got some big investments that I've seen on your website, like Anduril, but you're mostly focused on uh, mid market. I think you've got here $3 to $20 million of revenue. Um, Can you give us some, maybe give us some examples of some of the smaller companies that you've invested in? What kind of sectors they're in?
Yeah, so we originally kind of started off as a traditional venture capital firm, more focused on those seed to Series A companies. And we realized that there is a huge gap in the market on what we call scaling capital, capital to help that business turn from the the technology, technology readiness to that commercial viable business. And we found, looking at different models, we were very inspired by the Danahers, the Heikos, the Teledynes, these models of great industrial companies that were able to bring a lot of specialized capabilities with longer duration capital, shared services, and a way for founders to continuing their mission of advancing their technology and doing it in a way that it's profitable for them, their employees, and profitable as an entity a whole. And so
Yeah.
we're looking at, some of the businesses, we kind of have 2 buckets of businesses we look at. So the traditional, I would say, lower middle market businesses. So these are anywhere between, I would say 10 to about $30 million in revenue, usually have been around for 10 plus years, often are building specialized parts for the F-35 or the bolts for the KC-135 tanker. And then the second segment of businesses, I would say, are the kind of defense technology businesses. So these are businesses that end up starting off as a venture backed company, but end up finding product market fit, maybe in a market that's very highly specialized. A good example is, let's say I'm inventing a new type of, virtual reality goggles for the military, but in the end, I find out that really my main buyer is especially it's a specialized army unit, and it doesn't have that kind of $1 billion total addressable market share. And often the venture industry kind of ignores those companies like that. We run towards those companies because we are able to take companies that have that IP or technical differentiating and being able to expand that with our kind of acquisition and scaling model.
Okay. So if I was going to start up a defense company, which is a great industry, this so far this year, anybody who's been investing in it is probably pretty happy. The only thing that's done better are gold ETFs, but they've outperformed the broader market by about one third. So I think the North American mutual funds have gone up like 21%, and the defense industry mutual funds have gone up in the 30s, like 33%, 35%. So it's pretty lucrative, I guess. The What would be your dream? business if you could choose?
I guess the dream business would be like a specialized component maker. So let's just say a specialized lock company that serves industrial businesses in the kind of industrial base with building locks, let's say for security, for like industrial warehouses, things like that, and also have applications where those locks have a standard that are used, but say by the U.S. nuclear command or used by very, very mission critical part of the military. That one, I love those businesses because they have a long term defensibility, but also their specialization really allows you to keep on pushing innovation in ways that companies that like the traditional primes or companies with more broad base, kind of more traditional venture markets, have to be all things to all people. And this really allows that, like I like to say, a isosceles triangle company or that capability really to develop. And if we kind of look at history, that is what those are those companies that end up finding those breakthroughs that kind of open the floodgates for everyone else.
Hmm. And yeah, and I think the security in general is something that's, I think, really transferable to the consumer market as well. Might not be quite as robust, but there are probably lots of applications in the consumer market and other industries for things like that.
Actually, there's a great story that, oftentimes I tell people it's easier to go commercial to defense than go from defense to commercial. But one of the great stories in the industry around 9/11, there was a couple guys about in the late 90s who were trying to help tuna fishermen in Washington find ways to catch better, catch tuna using better technology. And this is kind of really in the early innings of, I would say, the drone industry. And there was a 9/11 happened, and there was a Marine colonel who happened to be going on a vacation in that part of northern Washington, and he came upon these guys who had this kind of garage drone company using it to use it for tuna fishermen. And he quickly realized that these guys had built a capability that the military badly needed, especially as we were going transitioning from to the war on terrorism. This company eventually, thanks to this colonel and a lot of other things that happened, ended up partnering with Boeing, ended up becoming one of the largest drone companies during the war on terror. It's called Itsu, and eventually got acquired by Boeing. I don't recall the amount. I think it was a very good exit for the founders, but it's kind of one of those things where who would have thought tuna fishermen and finding IEDs had a fair amount of crossover.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. The one of the things I thought when I was looking at the Anduril website, which is very impressive, they've done a whole lot of stuff. Even though it was founded by a billionaire, uh, 1 billion in the great scheme of things compared to companies like Boeing is actually not that much. And I just sat there wondering, how can these companies like Lockheed and Boeing allow Anduril to come in and essentially eat their lunch? Because that seems to be the future of aviation warfare and defense. So the looks like there's room for newcomers there. Um, but do you think that once those big companies decide to start getting into that a little bit more, that they'll come back and retake their position, or will these new drone companies just keep getting bigger?
I think they're like two very, very different types of businesses. So the traditional primes, Boeing, Lockheed, Northrop Grumman, RTX, those businesses are really systems integrators that have been around for almost some of them for over 100 years, and they really have that. They have a long tenured trust in the Pentagon and long tenured supply chains that are really designed around this older, kind of more traditional style of where our military security comes from, which is around exquisite systems. So building things like the F-22 Raptor that at the time it was built, it would take over, I think, over 50 Russian MiGs to have this to be competitive on the lethality aspect of it. And that was just a concept plane for the F-35s. We built these really highly specialized systems with sensors, or that's how you end up getting some of the $12,000 soap dispenser, that tends to make the news, is because these systems are think of them like custom suits that are designed so tailored for very, very specific mission capability. And that has
Hmm.
often been driven by, because these programs are so, so large, there's a fair amount of bureaucracy associated with that. And you have to be thinking about that from a systems level. So sustainment and and so traditionally it's been driven by kind of RFIs and RFPs. But where Andrew and kind of the defense tech movement really comes in is, we saw this in Ukraine, we saw this in the Israel Hamas war, that warfare is really moving away from having the most sophisticated fighter jet to really about these kind of lower cost systems that really have some phenomenal hardware, phenomenal software attached to it. And these, what we call this attritable systems. And that shift is happening and is creating more room in the market for a company like an Anduril and many others. So I would argue that the primes are always going to exist because you're always going to have some very, very sophisticated platforms. And now we're, expanding that toolkit with what Andurils and the Shields AIs and some of the other, companies are bringing to market.
Hmm. So I wanted to ask you about low tech as well, because a lot of the focus now is on drones, and it just seems that robots will be the future of defense. But the recently the Ukraine war seems to have been won and lost based on the number of howitzer shells that can be manufactured, um, where the Russians are making a couple million a year. And there's one factory in Germany that makes something like 300,000, um, from Krups or whatever, Mittelstahl, some company like that. And then there's an American factory that makes a few 100,000, and one in South Korea. I think those are the only three in the West that I've seen mentioned in the media. Um, are we ignoring traditional military hardware that can't be ignored, or is that a bygone era now?
I actually think this is a larger question. And I'd argue in 1969, we landed on the moon and the Concorde was debuted for the first time. In 2023, Airbus's new concept aircraft, that's it's their vision for the future, was a propeller plane that was big invention with basically being all electric and actually goes slower. The average flight between New York and Los Angeles actually takes 45 minutes longer today than it did in 1970. And there's a famous story when 747 was built in the early 1970s. There was a guy who was kind of iconic CEO of Pan Am Airways, a guy named Juan Trippe. And he told the Boeing CEO, says it's a shame that 747 is a beautiful aircraft. The shame it's only going to fly for a decade because we're all going to be flying Concords by the
Hmm.
that's probably why maybe Pan Am went bankrupt. But it just goes to show that the since the 1970s, our capital markets, our talent, our industrial base has really been oriented around digital technologies, building software, building things behind the screen and building more screens. Really has not been oriented around building what they call the world of atoms. This deep technology or building things in the physical world is still relatively new, and really the first big wave of investment really didn't start until about 2015, 16.
Hmm. So, one of the things I was wondering though is, why is the West so inept at making these low tech things like shells? Why can't the United States just say, okay, well, we're going to build a factory and make a million a year? Because the United States has the greatest industrial capacity, and that's how World War II was won, was that they just pumped out endless amounts of whatever was needed. So why can't they do that now?
That's a great question, Thomas. As I said before, the industrial base as a whole is struggling. We just had less innovation in the physical world. A lot of that is if kind of globalization has been kind of unchecked. We didn't realize the to the extent of that there's negative externalities with globalizing every supply chain until what happened and all of us saw during COVID. And So supply chains were optimized for the last 30 years to be as fast and as cheap and as efficient as possible. And now we've realized that having resiliency, having domestic and nearshore capacity is not just a nice to have, it's an essential to have. And that is a relatively new muscle. Like, I think Boeing hasn't come up with a new plane in 30 years. The F-35's original designs were designed in 1994. If the F-30 before the F-35 from design to its first line of production, it would have been 21 years. The plane would be able to legally drink at that point. And and part of that reason is, the Cold War ended in the early 90s, so there was this huge peace dividend. And as the when the war on terror happened, it was such a specialized finding non-state actors. We needed a very different type of capability set than we do today. And so now we are just it's really since the 1990s, we are just now building that we're in kind of a new defense super cycle as we're moving kind of the era we call the era of the long peace is over, and we're moving to a much more post-World War II multipolar world.
Hmm. Well, I think there's a lot of opportunities for also integrating high tech with traditional technologies. You look at all the interesting shotgun shells. There are some of which have been developed by Israel, like for non-lethal crowd control. You can put a taser in a shotgun shell. Uh, there's all sorts of neat things. So what maybe you could put something in a howitzer shell to shoot a drone 20 miles and then it takes off. Some Who knows, but I'm just thinking, if I were to set up a factory to make shells in the middle of Saskatchewan with a South Korean company, is that something you think would be a good investment, or would venture capitalists think, no, this is a bygone era. We're not going to need howitzer shells anymore in the future because some drone is just going to fly up to your cannon and blow it up.
You know, I think the war in Ukraine has shown that a howitzer shell is quite valuable and still works. At the end of the day, war is about being able to project lethality, and sometimes emerging technology is the best vehicle for that. Other times, we're still using guns which have the relatively the same architecture that haven't changed in about 250 years. Um, and so I think the challenge of reshoring manufacturing, we almost have to think about this like from a blank slate, because the West, we do not have the labor or the same kind of industrial facility capacity that we did in the 1950s. Mainly because one, we offshored all of the kind of commoditized part of our supply chain to China, and then two, the our capital markets are not used to funding things that are very capex intensive that have risk attached to it. And the fortunate reality, at least I can speak on the American end, the Department of Defense is a terrible customer. They're quite fickle. Because of congressional, we're in a government shutdown right now because of congressional budgets. You can have a contract today, but next year your contract can be slashed. And if you're going to put $300 million to go build a facility, usually in modern manufacturing, you need something called an offtake agreement that shows that you have demand in order to get financing for that. And oftentimes, defense, the DoD cannot give you those assurances. So oftentimes, you're trying to create the most minimal footprint possible to deliver your order, because you don't know if you're going to have sustained demand.
Yeah. See, and I thought it would be a bit of a no-brainer to just have a factory that makes, say, 250,000 a year, and a government contract that says, we'll buy everything you can make for the next 20 years. Uh, the risk is you only have one customer, pretty
Yeah,
much.
the monopoly of
And
a customer.
yeah, now mind you, if you were in a country like Canada or the United States, you can sell to all of the NATO countries. So you really would have numerous customers, and they probably each want 250,000 a year. So I still don't understand why that's not going ahead. Um, it's I don't know. Do you have any idea, like, why isn't somebody doing that?
There are some companies. A friend of mine runs a company that's using kind of build robotics so you can build energetics more efficiently. The challenge, what we're saying is kind of the West. is what I would say trying to figure out kind of a new, like within, the US and Europe is trying to figure out kind of a new national security, I would say, covenant. And part of the, traditionally after World War II, a lot of gun manufacturing moved to Europe because that wasn't as, capital intensive and complicated to do there. So a lot of the best gun manufacturers you tend to find in the, and then the things that were more higher tech and needed more capital and engineering complexity tend to be less. And now Europe is kind of has is thinking about its own sovereignty in a unique way. And while it's duplicative, a lot of them want to make sure they have their own ammunition, some of their own domestic capability themselves for their own sovereignty. While I think that there can be some overlap, I do think having a far more distributed base for something like howitzer shells, I think is a net positive for the West as a whole.
Yeah, and if you have it in the middle of Saskatchewan, it's going to be hard to get to. So you put it in Poland, and your enemy can destroy your factory anytime they want. So I think we should jump back into high tech, though. Enough with the shells. I've seen a lot of companies making different kinds of drones, mostly aerial drones, but there also are the undersea drones, the marine drones, I guess you could call them. Now, with these aerial drones that look sort of, we're all familiar with the kind that are currently being used, but there are new companies that are trying to make these things that are sort of like personal vehicles, taxis, based on sort of a large quadcopter drone design, big enough for two people to ride in. Have you seen anything like that coming on?
Yeah, I'm really encouraged about what's going on in the aviation tech space. And I think it's really born one of the positives of what we call the ZERP era, the last the era before COVID, where interest rates were held very very low, is we got the venture capitalists poured money, and I would say moonshot bets that would probably have never raised money in a more in a capital environment we have today, and that innovation, even if it fails, has some huge still opens those avenues for others. And so, thanks to some of the material science companies, some of the new deep technology companies, some of this company, I ran a new space company for a while. Some of these companies, they have now built out some of the supply chains and some of the infrastructure that now allow us to, for better drones, for, drones that don't just take pictures of things, but drones that actually can be, like, handle complicated logistics, drones that can augment what nuclear submarines could only do. And we are just, I think, seeing the chapter one of this. I think as we get more comfortable with drones in the battlefield, and they'll build up that software develops that heritage, and then autonomy develops heritage. I think we're going to see drones on the consumer end, where we are Amazon drone delivery are going to be regular parts of modern life.
Yeah. So I think I guess one of the problems is that when you take something that was built for civilian use, the military will then say, well, yeah, but it's got to now be mil spec, and it's got to be bulletproof, and it's got to be rugged, and it's got to work in the middle of a desert and not crash like the helicopters that were sent to rescue the hostages in Tehran in like 1979, I think it was, something like that. So they have all these requirements then that take something that might cost a few $100,000 and make it cost millions of dollars. Is that a big problem to overcome, to go from consumer to military, that ruggedization and meeting these military specifications?
I think it's an issue, but I think it's a very solvable issue, where it gets overcome as we figure out what parts, like instead of, EV batteries will be very, very hard for the United States to compete with China. I mean, China has just, they have built out the infrastructure, they have the population where they can drive the volume advantages. But that allows us to then to think about, okay, why should we, instead of focusing on batteries, why don't we focus on hydrogen, some frontier energy sources that we can own, The Chinese have a saying where they don't want to just focus on things for today. They want to focus on the things that grandchildren will benefit from. And I think some of that long-term thinking is something we in the US and the West could develop more of. That's what we're trying to build at 1890 in terms of that longer duration capital structure that allows that kind of long-term mindset to occur. Um, but I think uh, the at the end of the day, I think we will eventually, I think, find the right parts of our supply chain to bring in house. The way I liken it, in the 1970s, or late 1970s, you had the Iranian oil crisis, and oil prices, people were raiding gas stations, and for the first time, modern post-war II Americans really saw an effect of a foreign event in the homeland. And at that point, Americans was importing about 45% of our oil, and we kind of said, hey, we want to be energy independent. We don't want to ever have that liability again. And within about 20 25 years, thanks to some new technology like fracking and some incentives that the government was able to put out, private industry was able to take what was kind of unusable or unexplored area in Texas and the Permian Basin, turn that into a viable long-term energy source, where now the U.S. is a net energy exporter. And that happened in less than 30 years. So, there is, when America wants to achieve something, when it has its technology, its government incentives aligned, it can move mountains.
Yeah. Well, my next question was actually going to be about how a lot of these new technologies are electric, right? So when you're up on the front lines, how do you plug in these things? Um, it's great if you don't need fuel, because fuel requires a supply chain, and a lot of these places, for example, when Germany invaded Moscow, there was one highway with two lanes and giant ditches on either side. So it wasn't hard for the Russians to just keep bombing that one highway. We saw this when the Russians were invading Kiev. There was one highway with two lanes with giant drainage ditches on either side. And you just blow up one tank and everything comes to a screeching halt. Um, It'd be great if you could just plug things in and you didn't need to worry about fuel, but what are you going to plug it into? How is all that electric stuff going to work? Would you have to have generators and still supply fuel?
This is where I think hydrogen is a really interesting solution, because if you have uh, platforms and drones and things that are powered by hydrogen, you only need water and power that you can put. You don't need that much power because the electrolysis doesn't use the same amount of power it does to charge your battery. And so, what we, I think one of those, I think that you bring up a great point. If you're going to be operating in these frontier environments, you need to basically have kind of an all-in-one solution. I think hydrogen, just as an example, is something that's really interesting. There's some interesting things that are going on in the small modular reactor space that could have basically power on the front lines that we would never thought possible. And as those innovations start bearing fruit, we will, I think, see leapfrog, I think, some of the needs on the EV battery.
Yeah, because when I've seen images of like robots, and not sort of like the Tesla robot that's standing there, you know, taking a cardboard box off the shelf or whatever, but these what's the name of the company, United or something like that? Very impressive, and they look like they have this big backpack on their back, and I'm just guessing that must be the battery. And they don't say how long the battery runs, but these things look like they use up a lot of electricity. So uh, no one's ever really said. They talk about robot armies and that sort of thing, and it's sort of like, okay, well, and then what'll you do? It only works for 2 hours and then it runs out of batteries. Are you going to plug it in? Like, you've got 1,000 robots, where you're going to plug them in? 10,000 robots. um, so I think it's a big problem. You think that hydrogen can somehow solve that problem?
I think hydrogen, the fuel cells in hydrogen are still quite expensive. They still have to come down in price for it to be more widely adopted. But uh, I do think I I likely think that we will, if we're having this conversation, let's say 30 years from now, we will likely cite a 1970s oil type of example as what solved the problem.
Hmm. So does higher hydrogen have more power density than gasoline?
I'm not an expert on hydrogen, so I don't know. I don't know if I
Hmm.
can confirm that fact. But what I can tell you is hydrogen is, there are some new innovations where you can use non-pressurized containers for hydrogen, which reduce the
Hmm.
flammability of hydrogen, so it's much safer to travel.
Hmm.
There's some new innovations that are coming online that are allowing you to basically make this because as things are getting faster, smaller, cheaper, that allowing you able to do, you can have one big hydrogen unit, you can have a very small hydrogen unit. So it's that a marine platoon can use. And so we really, it is, it is just one example of something you can modularize to fit that mil spec, mission need that, that, that what service kind of needs to accomplish its goal.
Yeah, there are now companies that are working on miniature nuclear power plants and saying, look, what we use on submarines that work safely for decades, we can we can build those, and then you can move them anywhere in the world. Um, Not constantly, but you would move it once. So it'd be the sort of thing that could power a military base, but it's nowhere near the point where you could then move it up to the front lines and have people recharging things on the front lines. And it's not going to do you a lot of good if you have to fly back to the base, charge your batteries, and then go miles and miles back to the front. By the time you get to the front, your battery's half empty again. They also don't work well in cold weather. In Canada, some people have found out that they can't even get into their Tesla when you've got a temperature in the minus 20s with a wind chill factor can be minus 40s in a lot of parts in Canada, like Ottawa, our capital, for example. You get wind chill factors in the minus 40s quite often in the wintertime. So a lot of technological problems there to overcome before we get into the robot armies taking over. I think it's going to be interesting to watch. Do you have any predictions you can give us before we wrap this up?
Well, I would say any prediction is usually a chance for it to be 100% wrong. But I'll
Sure.
close with this. During World War II, there is a General Motors kind of came up with this new type of vehicle. No one really, originally when they came up with it, it was the military had asked for this because they needed a vehicle that was small and cheap enough that they could, for officers and soldiers to kind of traverse on the front lines in some of these environments where like the woods in Belgium. Um, and they thought, who the hell would? There's no commercial market for this. That ended up being the Jeep. And as GIs came back home, they realized everyone missed that Jeep, the car that they had during their time in Europe and the time of the Pacific Theater. And that technology, Jeep is now a stalwart brand. Stellantis, who's the parent company of Jeep, is putting a $13 billion factory in Ohio. And so I think, will likely happen, predict that there will be a drone that we will be used in some sort of low intensity, or hopefully we don't have the nightmare scenario of war with China never happens, that eventually gets repurposed domestically and becomes the Jeep of the 21st century.
Well, it'll be interesting to see. So, thank you very much for agreeing to come on to the show. It's been very great to listen to your insights. And if you like this kind of content, please like and subscribe. And that's it. Say goodbye. We're signing off now.
Take care.
Bye for now.